multiplying, and we're going to practice it by hand with numbers, and then you should be able to do this by hand with, we'll throw in letters at you. So again, practice this by hand. You can check your answers by plugging them into the calculator, but do it by hand first, because what we'll do on the quiz and the final is we'll throw letters in there so you can't use your calculator. So it's easier to practice when you have numbers, and we'll also practice with letters, but when you're first introducing this, so make sure you do these by hand, is what I'm saying. Alright, so all of these, the matrix math is going to be defined. So I have A times B, and I can do the math, right? A is a 2 by 3, that's my matrix A, and B is a 3 by 2, right? The middle numbers match up. When I actually do the multiplication and multiply A by B, I should get a 2 by 2 out. Alright, so I'm going to write down my matrix A and my matrix B, because I'm going to work in the space below. Fix things, make sure I don't mistype something. Alright, so the first thing is I'm going to kind of explain what we're going to do. Alright, so I'm going to, remember, matrix A represents my rows. So I have 2 rows in matrix A. I'm going to multiply by my 2. So this is my row matrix. This is my column matrix. So I have 2 rows in matrix A. I'm going to multiply by the 2 columns in matrix B. Each of the rows and columns have 3 numbers in it. Those are telling me. And so I can do the math. And so my matrix A has this row 1 and this row 2. My matrix B has column 1, column 2. And so when I get my resulting 2 by 2 matrix out, I'm going to take row 1 times column 1 to get the first number here. Then I'm going to take row 1 by column 2 to get the second number there. I'm going to take row 2 times column 1 to get the number there. And row 2 times column 2. All right, the rows and columns tell me where my entry is, right? The first entry is row 1, entry in row 1, column 1. Second entry here is row 1, column 2, row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2. And so the numbers kind of tell me where I'm at. And so there's the matrix math I'm going to do. Right? I'm going to take each of these rows and multiply by each of those columns to get my 2 by 2 matrix. And it's the same row times column method that I introduced in the first video. So down here, I'm going to actually do the multiplication. Alright, so I'm going to write it out. You might be able to do the math in your head, and that's fine, but I encourage you the first few times to write it out. Alright, so remember, I'm going to go my first row, and then each one of my columns. Alright, so again, I've got 2 columns there. And so my first row times column 1, left to right, top to bottom. Right, going left to right, top to bottom. So 2 multiplies by my negative 2, so I get negative 4. Then I add 3 times 1, so negative 3, and then add 5 times 0, which is just 0. All right, that'll give me that first number there, row 1, column 1, once I do the math. Now I take my row 1 by my column 2, so still looking at row 1, now multiplying it by my column 2. So 2 times 4 will give me 8. Negative 3 times negative 7 will give me a positive 21. Plus 5 times 3, which will give me 15. And there's my second number. That's my row 1, column 2. All right, done with row 1. Sometimes I think it's helpful to kind of cover it up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to circle my other one. So this is the one I'm now looking at. So I'm now looking at this row, and I'm going to multiply it by each one of my columns. All right, so row 2 by column 1. That goes here. So negative 1 times negative 2 gives me out a positive 2. 0 times 1 is 0, plus another 6 times 0, which is 0. So that was easy. That's just going to leave me with 2. But that's the math that got me to the 2. All right, now my last one. Row 2, column 2. Row 2, column 2. Negative 1 times 4 gives me out negative 4. 0 and negative 7 is 0. And 6 and 3 is 18. And then my simplified expression. So this middle one is sort of the math. And if you want to do the mental math, you can. You can sort of skip this step. But I encourage you the first few times you practice the multiplication to write it out. I will do it every time, but you can skip it or do it or whatever. All right, now my final resulting matrix, my final answer, will be once I add those up. So I get negative 7 there, 44 for that one. That's just 2 and 14. And there's my final answer, negative 7, 2, 44, 14. Alright, next example, B times C. So B times, I can do the math. Right, I'm just going to write it down so that we have it. So my matrix B was a 3 by 2, not 2 by 3, 3 by 2. And it was the matrix negative 2, 1, 0, 4, negative 7, 3. My matrix C was a 2 by 2, so I can do the math. And I'll explain that in a second. 5, 1, negative 3, negative 6, one side. Said negative 3, but wrote negative 5. 5, negative 3, 1, 6. Let me double check and make sure I wrote it down right. Negative 2, 4, 1, negative 7, 0. Alright, so there's my B and my C. And so I can do the math because those middle numbers match up, right? I've got 2 and 2. Means I've got 2 numbers in my row and my column. And then I'm going to actually do the math. I've got 3 rows by 2 columns. 3 rows by 2 columns. Each of my rows have 2 numbers, and so the math does work. When I get my resulting matrix out, when I actually do the math, it's going to be a 3 by 2. How I get the 3 by 2, I'm going to write it in red. Alright, I've got 3 rows, row 1, row 2, row 3, and then I've got column 1, column 2. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of my rows by each of my columns. So row 1 by column 1, row 1 by column 2. Alright, there's my first 2 numbers in my first row. Done with row 1, now I move on to row 2. So I'm going to take row 2 times column 1, row 2 times column 2. Alright, there's my second row in my new matrix. And then row 3. Row 3 times column 1, row 3 times column 2. And I can do the math because I've got 2 numbers in each row that I can multiply by the 2 numbers in both columns. And now I go through and I do that. And I'm going to get a 3 by 2 out. And so again, I'm going to do the math below here. And I'm going to write out that middle step. It's up to you. If you want to do the mental math, you can do the mental math. These are just 2 numbers. But I encourage you to write it out the first few times you do it because you're less likely to make an error in that case. Alright, so first, row 1 times, so again, I'm going to highlight it here. Row 1 by my column 1. Alright. So I take my negative 2 times my 5. That'll give me out negative 10 plus 4. Alright, now row 1 times column 2. Alright, so negative 2 times 3 will give me out a positive 6 plus 4 times negative 6 will give me out a negative 24. Alright, done with row 1. Now move on to row 2. So I might highlight row 2. Alright, now I'm looking at row 2 by my column 1 by my column 2. Alright, row 2 is going to be 1 times 5, so that's 5. 7 times 1, negative 7, sorry. Negative 7 times 1, which is negative 7. 1 times negative 3, negative 3. Negative 7 times negative 7 will give me out a positive 42. And now I'm done with row 2. And now the last one, row 3. So now I'm looking at row 3 and going to do my column 1, column 2 math. Alright, so 0 times 5 is 0. Plus 3, 0, minus 18. And then I'm done once I do the addition for each one of those parts. So the first number is going to be negative 6, negative 18, negative 2, 39, 3, and negative 18. Alright, and there's my final resulting matrix. Negative 6, negative 18, negative 2, 3, and 18. Alright, we'll stop there. In the next example, we'll do it where we're going to do math, and I'm going to throw in... So this is how we kind of force your hand. We throw variable parts into it so that you can't plug it into the calculator. And those are the types of questions that will be asked on the quiz and the final over Chapter 4. You have to be able to do it by hand. Alright, so we'll do examples of that in the next videos.